welcome to the Urban Tree Festival. Just got a few more people joining, so I'll let a few more people come in.
So here we are. Bruce is here. I'm Patrick. We're really happy to be here, despite that little bit of stress. We're going to be talking about Saunders Seasonings. We're going to be talking about our business, which is upcycling, reusing felled trees in London, how we got started, what we do, and what sort of things we're doing with those trees and other furniture makers are doing with those trees. So I think, Bruce, you might just want to tell us about this next slide, which is where it all began, very briefly.
Well, and I first met at school at age 11. We formed a band, as you can see, and obviously split due to musical differences. He was a close grain sort of chap. I was a wide grain sort of a chap. But we reunited just under a year ago, put the band back together, and the new gig is timber. I've been doing this kind of 5 years. 6 years before, Pat joined me more recently to take on more of the kind of business side of it.
Cool. So we're here to talk about London urban forest. I think many of you will be quite familiar with this, given the topic of this event. But of course, there's roughly as many trees as there are people in this city. 21% of London is covered with trees, the canopy. And trees are, you know, a really, really great benefit to any city in many, many ways. So it's a quick map here to share with you, which is really quite a nice, beautiful overview of what London looks like, you know, in terms of a tree map. And if anybody wants to get hold of that map, it's available for free online. The London Tree Canopy cover map, just Google that, and up it'll pop, which is rather lovely. So what we're here to talk about today is fallen and felled trees. My bike. There's about 6,000 trees are actually felled in London every year, and most mercifully are felled before they fall over, as is on this picture here, you know, because they're diseased, they're unsafe, or to make way for human development. And now we love trees, we don't want to see them come down, but if they're going to come down, the nature of our business is to do something with them, to actually try and repurpose them into something of greater quality than wood chip and fuel for biomass. So next slide.
Yeah, this is just an example of what we try and do. This is, in fact, the Happy Man tree that was recently felled at a site in Manor House in North London. Big protest trying to save the tree. Unfortunately, that didn't succeed. And we kind of did our best to try and be able to get hold of this amazing London plane. But unfortunately, on this occasion, we didn't succeed. It's a tough gig, even trying to engage with the kind of powers higher up to persuade them that we're actually kind of worthy of doing this. And often it's easier for them, they just carry on what they're doing, and they're just easier to sweep it under the carpet.
But I think our feeling is that if a tree comes down, it should be saved if possible, or as much as possible. The timber can be reused. And one of the pieces of this really is that, you know, newly planted trees offer only so much compensation in terms of bringing back trees into the city, and of course saving the carbon that's lost when a tree comes down. So, you know, our feeling is that there's quite a lot of waste in terms of trees coming down. We want to try and do something better there. So, Bruce, talking of waste.
The first 20 years of my life lies in front of you. No, I spent years and years in the event production industry, running a production company, working with bands, but did a lot of corporate work with set building, kind of making of kind of corporate, what do you call it, kind of showcasing kind of stuff. And we'd spend weeks building kind of quite complex sets, designing a building out of MDF fiberboard, which 2 weeks later we'd have to go and take down and bin it. And I just got tired of it. I became aware at some point there was there's kind of more years behind me than in front of me, and I just want to do something with more of a legacy, and wanted to return to hardwood. My family, I kind of born in the north of England, actually was raised in Zimbabwe, and in the kind of African style that you couldn't really buy a lot of stuff. So whatever you got hold of, it broke, you had to fix it. You had to work out ways around using whatever resources you had. So my dad always had a workshop, and as kids, we were always in there, building things, smashing things, breaking things, used to using tools and just loving working with wood. So yeah.
I think what Bruce discovered was that it was really, really difficult to try and get hold of UK-grown hardwood to make furniture and things in London. It just wasn't for sale. You'd have to drive 60 or 80 miles out of London to buy hardwood grown in the UK. And I think, you know, what Bruce discovered and seems to be still the case is that about 90% of hardwood used in the UK is imported. And indeed, according to the Forestry Commission, the UK was the second largest net importer of forestry products, trees essentially, in 2018, just one behind China. So, you know, there's a lot of scope for improvement in terms of using UK wood, not relying on imports. So, all the while that it's not so easy to get hold of UK wood, the trees that are felled in London are mostly chipped and burned, used for firewood or biomass. And we think that's rather sad, not least this business of the embodied carbon being released in minutes. We estimated that if you're to replace the carbon that's been lost by burning a single old mature tree, it'll take pretty much 6 newly planted trees 20 years to offset that amount. So whilst people will say biomass is sustainable and carbon neutral, maybe in the long run, if, you know, properly managed forests, it's a big area for debate. I think there's no doubting that if you burn a tree, you've lost a lot of carbon and you can't win that back terribly quickly. Over to you, Bruce.
Yeah, in kind of going back to using hardwood, and actually started building some furniture for my house, and having to go a long way outside of London to buy some cherry, some English cherry. I actually spoke to a local tree surgeon who steered me towards a development actually 50 yards from where I live in Camden, at a Barrett's development on Camden Road, St Pancras Way, an old council office that's been turned into flats. And they felled this big old plane tree to make way for development. I managed to get hold of it and took it up to actually Black Horse Workshop some years ago, where we had it. We got a mobile sawmill in and milled it into these boards. And at that point, I was air drying, so I would mill the boards, put stickers between, and wait. Pretty much works out to be an inch a year for the timber to dry into the pretty much the kind of temperate surroundings of around about kind of 18%. But the problem was, of course, you wait a year and then you use the timber or pass the timber on to other makers, and then there's no more. And you're like, damn, we got to wait another year before the next one. So, but what I certainly did realize early on is that London timber is fantastic. A lot of these mature trees have kind of produced timber that no kind of plantation or forest trees can, in their character, certainly their age. You know, some of these are 200, 300, 400 years old, and London plane in particular has proved a hugely popular timber because it's not commercially grown. And of course, our London plane, well, the British call it London plane because we say we invented it. Other countries just call it plain or platane or whatever. But yes, it's certainly by far our most popular timber.
So if we look about the next 5 years, 5 years later, I think Bruce had sort of proved that this could be done, that you could actually get old trees from London that were being sent off for burning and turn them into something quite beautiful. And I think he felt strongly that, well, it should be done. And so, yeah, 5 years later, where are we at? I think the interesting thing that happened to Bruce was this. I'll let you talk about it.
Sorry, just pulling up on the slides. It was just great to be. It's kind of really reassurance and confidence to be kind of recognised, to doing something different. And of course, what we're doing by what we do is to also support the local economy. There's a lot of now local makers based in and around of London that are kind of coming up with product ranges based on the timber that we're felling that kind of probably wouldn't be doing that if kind of it wasn't for kind of our endeavours. So it's quite a kind of, it's a highly rewarding thing to kind of see that happen, that we're actually just the kind of custodians of the timber that passes through us and onto them, and in fact onto the end kind of user. So it was fantastic. This was it's backed by the Forestry Commission, and pleased to say it's Sadiq Khan's signature on it. Very, very happy.
I guess this is, we didn't win one of these, but some of you may know the Design Awards are essentially the sort of global Oscars for architecture and design. They got in touch with us and said, well, we would like to make our awards trophies for this year's awards from recycled London wood, which I believe you do. And so, cut long story short, we made these beautiful awards out of London Plane, and they were awarded to people virtually like this over the internet, to architects and designers around the world. So we've got a quick video here. I fear, let's hope it works. Let's see how we get on. But this was a little video done that shows the sort of work we do and what this was about. It's only a minute. We go. So nice to see Bruce smiling at the end of that. Over to you, Salvaging Trees.
Yeah, this is just an example of a typical day's work, really. No, it's not a typical day. This is actually something that comes up every once in a while. That's just it's just a fantastic opportunity. This is an very old elm tree from Gibson Square that had died of Dutch elm disease, became unsafe. I think a branch had dropped onto a car, and basically the council had basically had to fell the tree. They didn't want it chipped, and I got the call, and we went over there. But this is an example of how difficult it is and what we're up against. The tree couldn't actually be felled, as it were. They were going to ring it. Ring it means they're just chopping the small bits. So I had to get the HIAB in, the truck with a crane, to actually hold the tree while they cut it underneath. It was then lifted out, laid on the ground, put on the back of the lorry, and off we go. So the logistics are very difficult for extracting trees. Sometimes we just can't do it, and unfortunately the tree has to go. But this was it was a huge tree. It weighed about 5 tons, and we took most of the branches as well. They've been milled and seasoned. The trunk is still looking at us like a huge, great monster, waiting for us to tackle it.
So what I would say here is, what happens is that we're getting trees from local authorities, Islington in this instance, and a number of others, but also developers who are need to remove trees for development, and of course
Human
development, yeah. And so increasingly they are getting in touch with us, or we managed to find them and say, well, look, we could do something better with that tree than what you might ordinarily expect. There's also tree surgeons who will individually get in touch and say, look, I'm taking down this massive tree, perhaps you'd be interested. Can you get here by this afternoon? Because if you can't, it'll be chipped. And so that's the sort of nature. It's very bitty, this work, in terms of having to get out there and save a tree.
And obviously that tree would come across to, we have 2 sites, obviously the workshop in Black Horse Road, and then we have a kind of a small site on a farm out in Essex near Brentwood. And we tend to mill around 1 week a month, 4 days a month. And so at the moment we're milling around 10 trees, 10 cubic meters a month. That's quite a lot of timber.
Yeah, I think it's growing, but it's by no means all of the trees. I thought I'd just quickly show you this. It's another quick video which just shows you a bit about milling. This tree, Bruce, is Tree of Heaven, isn't it?
This is Tree of Heaven we got recently. From
gloriously named Tree of Heaven.
Yeah, it looks very similar to ash, and possibly will behave like ash when it dries. First time we've actually milled some of this, and it sounds more glamorous than ash, though, doesn't it?
It does indeed.
It looks quite.
This is actually an invasive species.
Yeah, so it deserves to be milled.
Oh, hang on. Okay.
This is a large beech we got from North London, a copper beech. This is only one section of it, and this is our Duncan, who's a man with a 4-foot chainsaw, and he halves the trees by hand, or by eye, I should rather say, and then quarters them because they're too big to get on the mill, as you can kind of see. Press the button.
I'm trying to press the button. There we are.
There we go. Go on, Duncan. Off you go, my son. 2, 3. Ah, there he goes. And that's why we employ Duncan, because he can just halve trees like that. Doesn't even use a saw.
Excellent.
Beautiful flaming in that, you could probably see. So also as part of that, this is an example of some planes we milled up from St James's Garden in Euston. We do hit a lot of bomb casing parts, World War II shrapnel. We've hit nails, we've hit concrete. We hit a chisel a few weeks ago that somebody had left in that we reckon was put in around the 1900s. Probably a gaffer's chisel that somebody ran out of nails and thought they use a chisel instead to hold up a bird box. So yeah, that's another reason of why urban trees are, it can be costly to extract. It's not just the transport. If you hit metal, there's a blade gone. Sometimes we lose an hour or 2 hours a day trying to extract the metal. You can't keep cutting once you hit it. We use a metal detector, but sometimes you just don't spot it, and you just got to dig it out. And sometimes, occasionally, we have to just stop milling the whole tree and put it to one side because there's just too much metal in it. So kind of never can tell. It's quite deeply frustrating, actually, but the reward of actually getting those boards out when you do is great. This is an example of some of those planks we got from that Islington elm. Just utterly beautiful, and just amazing to think that those are there for kind of future generations rather than just being burned in biomass.
I think you always say, Bruce, that when you actually mill the trees, it's always the most interesting colours that emerge.
Yeah, I must admit, milling is one of my favourite parts of the whole business. I'm always there milling. That first cut when you open up a tree in those first boards, the colour you see in the first, you've probably got about 2 minutes of seeing that colour before the oxygen comes in and changes it and it fades, and you never see that colour again. It reminds me a lot of when, like deep sea fishing, when you pull a fish up and you get those incredible colours, and as soon as you land the fish, the colours disappear, and it's yeah.
Didn't know you've been deep sea fishing.
Oh, in Camden Canal actually last week. Right.
I'll talk on this. I mean, it's so of course there's the milling, and then there's the seasoning. And seasoning is a word that sounds like salt and pepper, but it's essentially the process of drying wood to turn it into furniture grade timber. So the first process is the air drying, which Bruce did earlier with that first London plane. You're looking at anywhere between 6 and 12 months, sometimes longer, for the moisture to come out of the wood and reduce moisture content down to about 15 or 20% of the total mass, having come from what sort of level would you say?
Well, originally from green, you're talking kind of 60-70%, sometimes higher.
So there's a lot of water coming out, and so that process takes place outdoors under covers in the big stacks that you can see there next to our forklift.
Yeah, this is a new kiln that we bought recently. Everything we do, from whether it's tools, whether it's packaging, anything, we try and repurpose. It's just a conscious decision. I think it's just the kind of abhorrence, like Christmas, the amount of plastic rubbish that comes into the country. It lasts 1 week and is then binned. So this kiln was, it came off a truck. It was a refrigeration unit. It was already insulated. We've taken it and adapted it and put the kind of kiln drying elements in. And it's this then takes the air dried timber and reduces it down to 10% moisture content. That's our kind of typical target, which that makes it suitable for interior joinery. So when you cross join, when you've got cross grain joinery, this is where you want stability and low moisture content, so the timber doesn't expand or contract and blow the joint.
It's probably worth just emphasizing, actually, because I don't think we have, that the majority of wood that we're working with is hardwood as opposed to softwood, and it's hardwood that would be used indoors for furniture or guitars or other fine things like that, and that's why the temperature, the moisture has to be reduced to that level.
This is the same area. From next week, this is our new workshop space we take on out on the farm. We need additional storage and machining. I mean, essentially, we've doubled our size over the last year. And it's a lovely space, south-facing, very quiet. Yeah, very much kind of looking forward to getting in there. This is current and ongoing facility. This is Black Horse Road workshop. This is the machine room where we do a lot of, we either, you know, we'll sell on the sawn boards to other makers, but we also do a lot of prepared timber. We'll plane it and edge it. We also make simple furniture, particularly to local residents. We've kind of developed quite a local taste for London Plain where we are. But that's just yeah, that's just a kind of gratuitous workshop.
Yeah, but the thing to say, the thing to say about Black Horse as well, though, it is a metal and wood workshop where there are many members who get a chance to use its facilities, and essentially we're residents there and selling timber from that space. We also have a website, and we plan to have a website that sells wood and makes a much better case for what we do. At the moment, we've got a sort of small site, but that's a job just around the corner. Timber choice.
This is just an example of some what are they called, beer flights, where you put 4 little glasses, and they're just offcuts we did for Exhale, a local tap room. They do serve a lovely pint, and it's just you know, a little bit of fun to show the timbers where they come from. And again, just shows the beauty of the kind of different woods we use.
I think it's a little bit like English cheese, insofar as you don't need to go abroad. There's a wonderful selection available in the UK. I think there's just some lovely looking woods there.
I'm sure there's a lot of our European neighbours who are like, can't believe what Pat's just said, but
quite possibly.
But a good point though, Pat. It's a good point.
Well, yeah, so we talked about Gibson Square earlier and the elm that came from there. I think, you know, one of the things that's important really is to recognise that people value the wood that we are repurposing, not just because its functional use as a piece of elm, but because it's come from somewhere in London. It has provenance, it has history. And so I think that, you know, the furniture makers and the people who buy those bits of furniture or products value this sort of local provenance. I think it's increasingly the case that people are trying to shop locally, are trying to reuse and repurpose materials. So yeah, I think I think we're going to see more of this, and I do think it's nice to be able to provide the timber to furniture makers and give them an edge when selling their products.
We were talking about obviously the timber, but also, you know, kind of moving on to making of furniture. This is a kind of chance to show more of the stuff that has been made. We've a whole bunch of people, amazing makers. Apologies to those who have signed in that we haven't kind of featured your stuff. Christina, Rob, Brain, we love you guys. These are just some stuff we had to hand. This is a Coal Drops Yards. It's a tailor's table for Black Horse Lane Atelier. It's a 6-meter table, complete with some bomb shrapnel kind of way up there. There is, yeah, moving up there. There's some violin and cello actually made some years ago as a return to local community of some of the timber we've taken. This is for King's Cross Academy, for their kind of music department.
Yeah, I mean, Seb's a lovely chap. He's pretty much a kind of world reputed furniture maker who Bruce has been working with for quite some time. He's got very much a nature first perspective. You can see there as a mission statement for a business that's it's pretty environmental. And the whole idea is this heirloom idea of furniture. I had to look up the word heirloom to be reminded that it's something that can be handed down through generations. So it's very much in keeping with what we're about, trying to help people to make things that don't just last a short while, but may go on and pass through people's houses and lives.
Not a second life, but a third and fourth.
Indeed, indeed.
Mr. Patrick. Yes.
Gales Bakery. Bruce, I think that Gales Bakery has been very enthusiastic about London Plain in sort of decking out a lot of their artisan sort of bakeries. I think they really did say they wanted to use repurposed wood from London. And again, it's a company that's trying very hard to be sustainable and to be local. And I think that we'll see much more of that going forward.
Fits in beautifully with the local economy. Yep, this is LED globe makers who make these amazing hand-painted globes, and they get particularly London Plain from us for the bases. You can see there, particularly the medullary rays, the beautiful figure that Plain gives, which makes it so attractive. Those little eyes in the base are actually the bearings for the globe, kind of spinning 360. Right, moving on. One of our local makers, Tom, just showing some of the kind of more the waney edged boards from some hornbeam that we got from Uxbridge. And the incomparable Mario, who made this amazing guitar from some of our London Plain. Again, you can just see what an exquisite, beautiful timber is. It looks exotic, it looks oriental, but in fact, it's just from good old London. And I don't think I ever got to play that, but I could play my 3 chords on it.
You're better than that.
Slightly different use for our timber. This is a great relationship between Connor, who runs Foresso, and I. He appeared with a backpack years ago, took some offcuts, and explained to me this crazy idea. And years later, he's got a big unit in Birmingham, employs a whole bunch of people, and his business is going crazy. And we're proud to be a part of that. And essentially, he uses a lot of our waste from a bunch of timbers from London Plain and walnut and oak to make these incredible terrazzo tops where the timber's chipped and then kind of overlaid with a resin style material onto boards to make these great worktops.
But the point is that it's all from waste streams. So the resin and everything, there's targets there to try and be as sustainable as possible. So it's nice to be a part of that. Right. So I said to Bruce, I'd only include one such slide with a few, an Excel graph. But we asked our customers, we did a little survey in January to find out what people thought of us, because it's not a bad thing to know what's right and what's wrong. And what it turns out essentially is the blue lines are the stuff that people, when buying from us, feel are important. The orange is of some importance, and the grey to the right-hand side are things that are of little consideration. So anything with blue in is the stuff that people really value. And you can see 3 lines down that the environmental ethos is important, and that's extremely important and sort of key to what we're about. But the thing that I think is really valuable to learn here is that the quality of wood is seen as great. And some people might think, oh, this repurposed wood, maybe it's not quite so good, maybe it's a bit of a compromise. I think that this slide tends to suggest that that's far from the case, that people do value the quality and the choice. The environmental ethos is really important, and if you look at the line down the bottom, it tends to suggest fairly priced. So it feels like we're heading in the right direction with this. Here's one particular comment which yeah, I think was
Pat's mum did.
Yes.
Not really.
Thanks, Mum.
It was a very valid comment.
Yeah, I'll read it out just in case anybody's not looking at doing other things. I like knowing the source of the timber. Better to buy UK timber that would otherwise be scrapped than buy from abroad. I like the wide and unusual choice of timbers available. So yeah, it's just encouraging and helps to take us forward. So what about the future, eh? That's it's a fast-moving game, really. And I think that looking in terms of the market and what people want, it's clear looking on Google that people are really, really keen now, perhaps more so than ever, hopefully as we move towards the end of the pandemic, to source environmental, sustainable, eco sort of conscious products and consume in that way. And so I do think that we're onto something, and it's important that people want to engage in recycling. Many of you will be familiar with the idea of the circular economy. What does it mean? It's essentially a recognition that in the past, well, still very much the case, as a society, with the world, we tend to take materials, make things, use them, and then dispose of them. And there's a recognition that that really can't go on. So the circular economy is a concerted effort to make, use, but bear in mind how those materials might be reused. And so it's a lot of talk about that. There's actually the Circular Economy Week coming up in London next month, which I think we might be a part of. So in keeping with that circular economy idea, we found this idea that an organization in the US was proposing. And it was just nice to see that other people were thinking in somewhat of a similar way to us. The organization had recognized that cities in America had the same problem. Trees were falling and just being carted off to landfill. So this model they proposed, and I won't go into massive detail, but the idea is that those trees could be used, they could be milled, they could be made into things that are sold, and that the money raised, or part of it, could go back into the community in terms of planting new trees and enabling the urban forest to thrive. So, that's not necessarily happening here in the UK, but it's sort of the way we're thinking, and what our proposal is, what we're trying to make happen, really, is in recognition that one of the biggest challenges we face is actually, it's not necessarily getting the people who want to buy these things. There's a market out there for what we do. It's actually sourcing the trees in the first place. And so we need to try and change mindsets. We need to encourage people that this is probably a better thing to do than the status quo. So Bruce, maybe if you want to just talk about the grading idea.
Yeah, we just recognise that in fact, most trees that are felled because of human interference for development, for human reasons, are actually fine quality trees, and we believe they should be graded in urban areas in the same way they are outside, and that the A grade trees should. There should be a way of making those available before they're chipped. There's plenty of rubbish and brash to chip for biomass. and to make those somehow to make them available via an agent or however that's done. But the important thing is to actually have to go through the process of grading trees to give a chance for people to actually get a hold of them.
And then that's the opportunity for companies like us to take those trees and pay a fair price for them. Certainly pay more than they would get for chipping and biomass, and that some of that income might go back in a circular economy fashion into tree planting, because there's ambitions to grow tree planting in London from 21 to 23%. I can't remember over what period of time, but there's plenty of room for more trees to be planted, and there's plenty of spaces that are kind of waiting for trees to be planted. So it's not like everybody's sorted out how this works. But what we're about is, if we think more of this can happen and we can be doing more of this, then we can support the local economy. We can enable local businesses to make great value products out of upcycled materials that customers want. And if we can work with communities to actually take some of their trees and give back something in terms of like the cello racks Bruce talked about earlier into the local community, then we want to do more of that, because we think it's a key to actually encouraging trees to be actually reused. And ultimately, I think it's an opportunity here just to reconnect people with the city and its living history, and somewhat of a return to using things that grow locally. So I think we're pretty much there. The final slide is just to say, well, look, you can always help. We'd welcome any feedback here. We're learning as we go. Help us reach the right people. Tell us about trees, particularly sort of, relatively large trees that need to be felled. We can't save every small tree. Think about using local timber and buy from local furniture makers if you can.
And the final slide, which is a great message.
Now, Bruce wanted to put this in, and it is a great message.
I actually read the book and then saw this line in the book, and it kind of sums it up really. And if the mindset changes to think more about that, particularly in the kind of grading of trees, then that's a fine thing that we would have achieved as a kind of a legacy. What you make from a tree should be at least as miraculous as what you cut down. It's a great book as well. Yeah, so Bruce recommends that book. Thanks very much from the Glimmer Twins. Thank you. Now I need to try and hand back to Greg, which we'll see how we get on with that one. Bruce, can you see how to do this?
Yeah, stop screen sharing. Okay, fantastic presentation. Just so wonderful to see those trees being put to good use, and just the quality of the timber it's just absolutely incredible. So you're off screen. You're still, I can still hear you, but you're off screen. So I'll start with some questions. The first is from David Kerry. Could this model be duplicated for other cities or large towns? Do you have any interest in expanding more nationally? Greg, we only just caught the end of that question, but I think you said, do we have ambitions to expand more broadly? Your audio quality has gone very, very echoey again. Yeah. Sorry. So the first part was, could the model be duplicated for other cities as well as expanding nationally? So if you could just unmute yourself, Patrick. Can you hear us now? Yeah, it's very, very echoey though. Yeah, Bruce, can you turn that sound off? Sorry. Just give us 2 seconds while we kill this mute. There we go. Yeah. Do you want to ask that question? Yeah. Right. At the moment, we don't, because we think there's more than enough to do in London. But it is, I think, something that could be replicated in other cities. I think that London has its own peculiar difficulties because of the sheer size and scope of the city has meant that really trees have been largely ignored as a repurposing opportunity. But I think that other smaller cities are probably slightly
I think that Brighton, for example, does actually make trees available for people to bid for on auction.
Okay, great. Well, I've just seen one comment in the chat.
We can't hear.
Yeah, I've just seen one comment in the chat from Mario Morganti saying, "So you're the person who actually made that guitar." So I've got to say, what an absolutely exquisite job that was. It was incredible. But I'll pass to another question, which was from Gavin Rees. Do you collect any timber, or does it have to be of? So I suppose it's, do you collect any size of timber, or does it have to be of a certain species and size?
Kind of rule of my rule of thumb is, if you can't put your arms around it, then give us a ring. So if it's too big for a cuddle, then it might be worth us coming and getting. If it's something of the darker nature like walnut or elm, then smaller trees, it's definitely worth giving us a ring. The other thing, of course, is access. You need to think of access. Can we extract it? Can we get it out? If it's in a back garden and it has to come over a roof, it's unlikely it's going to be, it has to be economically viable. We're not a charity. We have to try and actually, kind of survive with the income we get. And some trees are just unviable, but it's always worth taking a photo and sending it by us.
Okay, great. So I'm going to combine two questions into one here. The first is, what about trees from parks? And the second is, do you do carving, making benches out of trunks for woodland?
Do we take trees from parks? Yes, if the parks managers allow us to do it. We'd love to steal along the middle of the night and just swipe some of these trees that I kind of see are being used as things like insect hotels, which seems a great shame. Because there are some terrible trees we can give them, half-rotten trees that are great for insect hotels. But the great straight timber that's lying in the parks, we'd love to repurpose that. Do we do carvings? We don't carve ourselves. We do have quite a lot of people who we pass on timber to in boards and trunks that do carve.
Okay, great, thanks. So one from Ian McDermott. Should we consider replacing the training of arboricultural surveyors with foresters who might appreciate the value of felled timber in the cities? Quite an interesting idea there.
It sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, speaking as an arboriculturist, the actual value of timber and measuring timber was never really something that I encountered on my training. And that's very much part of forestry, with forestry in the forest as opposed to the value of the trees in the urban forest as such. So one from Sarah Vaughan on the contentious issue of the tree felling of HS2. But when we see huge numbers of old trees felled, for example, in HS2, are those trees all likely to be sent for biomass, or have there been any sort of reuse and recycling as we've seen in your examples?
Sorry, you repeat the question, please.
Okay, sorry. So when we see huge numbers of old trees felled, such as the oaks for HS2, high-speed railway 2, are those trees all likely to be sent for biomass, or is there any timber reuse in those trees?
We are working with HS2 on their inner London sites, and we've repurposed a great number of trees. So, and even though kind of HS2 obviously have a lot of bad press, they are actually extremely active or proactive in repurposing their trees, probably more so than any other organisation I've come across. So, not a great PR kind of thing, but actually there's a lot of people, makers and so on, who have at least benefited from the life of that timber.
But also, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of people within HS2 who we've had contact with who are really keen to see these trees repurposed, who have looked to us as an organisation that can help do something better with them than would otherwise happen. And so we're talking to them and others to try and encourage repurposing of trees, and also to think of ways that we can work with them to bring elements of those trees back into their designs, because architects are increasingly under pressure to use recycled materials and materials that haven't necessarily been imported a great way. And I think that the trees that come down to make way for development could be used more in that way, and that's what we'd like to encourage.
I very much agree. There's sadly a lot of very large mature trees coming down for development. So yeah, as sad as it is to see them cut down.
I think what I would say is that it's a difficult one really, because we don't want to see trees coming down. It's not something that we would encourage people to do. And sometimes that can be a little bit conflicting for us, because we're thinking, well, okay, we don't really want to have that. That would be better if that tree stayed there. But if the tree's going to come down, then at the moment there's no better option. And so we would prefer to be part of a better solution, and to help encourage the sort of change we've been talking about today, that might see upcycling more encouraged.
Yeah, I very much agree. Question from Vic Keegan. Do you know what is the net gain or loss from the felling and planting of trees in London?
I'm not sure, to be fair. The net. Can you just repeat that one more time? Sorry, Greg.
So, what is the net gain or loss from felling and planting trees in London? I know that might expand a bit beyond the reuse of the timber, but if you knew the answer,
I think that goes back to your point about in terms of, if you talk about biomass or carbon retention, a mature felled tree, it takes 6 new trees 20 years to replace that carbon. Can that be accepted as the answer to that question?
I think so. I mean, I think the thing is, if trees are going to come down, I think the whole notion of the circular economy is that waste materials should be, or materials that are deemed to be as waste, should be used to their highest potential value. So if you can, use a tree that's fallen down as firewood, that's of some value, some people would say. But we would argue that maybe some of the tree could be used for firewood. But if the tree's stem has got the sort of quality of wood that we've been talking about today, it seems to me that there's greater value to everybody in that wood being used.
Absolutely. One question here. I suppose this is to do with local authorities, but have you had any success or seen any change in local authorities with their planning conditions in terms of timber salvage? So, from the onset of the development, where trees are being removed, they're actively wanting to try and retain as much of the timber as possible for projects.
I think that Bruce and I are trying to investigate and understand this more, and if anybody can help us, that would be useful. But I feel that it's more down to individuals like yourself, Greg, and others who have been enthusiastic about the idea of trees being repurposed, rather than it being something that has been adopted as a policy on high. Yeah. And so it's often the case that somebody will say, well, look, this is just madness. This tree is going to be chipped by tomorrow. Would you guys take it and do something better with it? But it's not. I think it may be more difficult for us to get to the higher levels of people who then have to consider a whole bunch of different questions of like, well, okay, so if a tree is going to be taken away, it's going to take more time. It's going to leave roads closed for a day. Can we afford to upset the public with that? Where's the tree going? I think that there's work to be done to try and make that change.
Essentially, we're kind of swimming against the tide in a major way, and we realised recently our challenge is not actually producing timber, which is what we're quite good at. It's actually getting hold of the trees in the first place to save them from just being wasted, and that's essentially our biggest challenge, which is to try and enable a mindset higher up the chain where people who can draw up policy and enact policy, that's where it's going to happen. It's not going to happen at ground level other than the people who are passionate about a particular tree being reused.
Yeah, again, something I very much agree with. People kind of on my level are kind of somewhat restricted in what we can do for the larger developments in local authorities, that is. And also someone's put up quite a good point from Fred Rogers, and that's, the trees that go off to be used as firewood. It's worth remembering that, of course, the burning of the wood produces more pollutants as well as releasing CO2, and especially in London, they're trying to restrict the amount of wood burning as well because of the really bad levels of air pollution.
Well, I think quite a lot of progress has been made in reducing pollutants in the air. I don't speak with any great authority on the matter, but I do think that one of the biggest issues now is the pollutants that come from burning wood. And that's the problem, for example, with domestic wood burning. And I guess from also biomass as well.
Yeah, there's a question coming from Sarah Vaughan. We have a tree work schedule for street trees, so know in advance when trees are likely to be felled. Should we be lobbying the council to call you? And I'm assuming that Sarah is part of a tree group or a tree warden network or something. So I suppose that's quite a good example of having someone in the community knowing about your work as well as knowing when the council trees are going to be removed, and that's a good. That's where I recognise the name Trees for Bermondsey.
Well, I would say yes. We'd always be extremely interested. It's hard for us to know as a very small company what's happening across London. So if people have got their eyes and ears out, that's great. The other thing I would say is that if people have ideas for how those trees could be reused back in their communities, if they have some ideas, which we're always keen to give a proportion of the wood back into communities, to mill the timber, dry the timber, make it available, but just to give some of that timber back for good projects. So we'd always be interested in those ideas if people have ideas for that.
Yeah, great stuff. And I think you've probably got some good contacts in the Trees for Bermondsey group now.
That's fantastic. Wonderful.
Yeah. Right, so I think we'll probably have to call it there because we're 6 minutes past 7. But I want to say a huge thank you to Bruce and Patrick. It was a really, really fascinating talk, and yeah, really lovely to see how that wood is being reused and what can be done with it rather than just firewood and biofuel. Just a reminder that the festival, Urban Tree Festival, carries on until Sunday the 23rd. So please check out the website to see more events that you might be interested in. So thank you all very much. Have a good night. This presentation has been recorded.